Bună seara tuturor, bună seara doamnelor, bună seara domnilor. Sunt Marius Constantinescu, live pe pagina editurii Humanitas. Mulțumesc de la bun început tuturor celor care ați ales să petreceți acest început de sâmbătă seară alături de noi. Alături de noi pentru că în această seară avem plăcerea de a sta de vorbă într-un mod cât mai creativ și subliniez acest cuvânt cu un compozitor american, care este și coautorul uneia dintre cele mai interesante cărți pe care am citit-o în ultima vreme, o apariție la editura Humanitas chiar anul acesta, 2020, Specia, rebelă, despre creativitatea oamenilor și despre modul în care ea schimbă lumea, de David Eagleman și Anthony Brandt. Doamnelor și domnilor, în această seară, live împreună cu noi, compozitorul Anthony Brandt este alături de noi, alături de dumneavoastră, pentru a vorbi puțin despre cum se poate desface procesul creativ, unul despre care avem senzația că știm multe lucruri și despre care vom vedea că merită să aflăm mult mai mult. Anthony, hello, and thank you for joining our dialogue today.
Marius, honored to be here. Thank you so much for spending the time with me, and welcome to our listeners.
It's a pleasure to have you as our guest. I was just telling our viewers about the book you have wrote together with David Eagleman, The Runaway Species, the Human Creativity Remakes the World. So we're going to talk about the creative process, this engine that puts the whole world into motion. And thank you from the very beginning for this book, which is in itself a creative, comprehensive, and sometimes funny overview of the human creative process, in which you emphasize the importance of three dimensions, I would say, which is altering, fragmenting, and also mixing. So my first question would be, what did you have to alter, fragment, and mix in order to come up with this book?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. So I think you've focused right on one of the most critical and exciting things for David and me when we were writing the book, was that we wanted to show that all creativity is based on a certain number of mechanisms. That's part of every human brain. And how we apply that is up to our own passions and interests. But the basic processes we use to imagine new things that have never existed before are shared by every person. And so creating those links between different disciplines, which are often viewed as very separate from each other, a scientist versus an artist, and finding examples where we could say, look at the correspondence here. That was one of the exciting things. And I think that was a novel feature of our book, that we would put side by side an example from science and an example from art. I'll give an example. The modern mobile phone was invented in a way I was surprised to find out about. It used to be that there was one cell phone tower in every major city. And that meant maybe a few dozen people could get on the phone at the same time. Otherwise, you get a busy signal. And obviously, you know, we're all carrying around mobile phones in our pockets. It's hard to imagine this world where like 20 people in any place could be on the phone. And then an engineer at Bell Labs came up with the idea of breaking the territory covered by that one tower into different cells, each of which would have its own tower. And that's where the word cell phone comes about in English language, why it's called a cell phone. And, you know, David and I looked at that and said, my goodness, that's very similar to how Picasso broke the, visual plane into multiple perspectives in Cubist art. And that kind of stitching together different disciplines, that to me was one of the most enjoyable and fun parts of writing the book.
Well, thank you for this example. Actually, your book is full of them, which makes it so easy and fun to read, as I was mentioning before. And also, I would take each and one of these directions under a closer look, which is altering, like reshaping an existing form or an existing value, and therefore renewing it, right?
Right, totally, yes.
Okay.
And I'll say a little background to this, and maybe, you know, this is an interesting story. David and I each brought a certain view of creativity to our discussion. And what was very exciting was finding an almost complete overlap. And in fact, people sometimes ask, well, where did you disagree? And the answer was, well, we didn't disagree, which was, you know, very exciting for me because he's such a brilliant scientist. And David brought an understanding of the neurological basis of creativity and also its evolutionary roots. What I brought to the table was this idea of those three mechanisms and a way of possibly describing them. And where that came from was music composition. I thought to myself at a certain point, both for David and I, bringing more arts to kids was one of our motivations for writing the book.
Right, and you emphasize that towards the end of the book.
Exactly, yeah. And American education, especially public school education, is literally starved of the arts. It is always the first thing to be cut from budgets. And it was our hope that, especially with scientific vigor behind an argument, that it would be harder to resist the idea that every single child should have exposure to the arts. And so you know, at a certain point I was thinking, you know, if I walked into a classroom of young kids and I tried to stimulate their creativity and even educate them into creative thinking, would there be a certain tool set that would be, you know, immediately applicable to them? And so I thought, well, in composing, could I summarize everything that I need to do? And I thought to myself, okay, I need to be able to write variations. That's the same thing as a cover of a pop song or a jazz improviser or the great theme and variations that Beethoven and other classical composers write. I need to be able to fragment my material. That's a very characteristic thing in classical music. You don't just always hear the theme in its entirety. You hear it broken up into little pieces of it and then reassembled. And then I'd want to be able to combine different ideas. That happens, you know, very gloriously in the music of Bach, for instance, where he'll have multiple themes playing at the same time. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that, exactly as you've said, alteration, fragmentation, and combination pretty much summed up everything that I would need to do. And then I thought, okay, so could I apply that to other arts? And, you know, through very careful study, I found that, well, yes, you could apply that to other arts. For instance, in filmmaking, a double image is combining something. Editing and splicing out the sequence of time is fragmentation, and so on. And eventually, you know, the question then became, well, could you apply it to anything? And the longer I thought about it, the more I became convinced, well, yes, everything can be described as some combination of those three strategies working together. And so, you know, that was the part that I brought to our collaboration. And it really is rooted in music composition.
Well, thank you for all these examples. Obviously, I was thinking about music as well. And I also appreciated in the book the fact that there is no tension or no friction between the arts and the science, because sometimes we have the tendency of looking for something like that. I mean, arts and science, we would have the impression that they don't go really well together. Well, the reality is exactly the opposite.
Totally. And working with David was just so fantastic because, you know, he's very singular. He is not only one of the world's greatest neuroscientists, but he's also a very accomplished novelist, and he has a beautiful book of stories called Some that I highly recommend. And so he really has a foot in both sides of that. And to him, it's utterly ridiculous that there should be any tension between the creativity of a scientist and the creativity of an artist.
Right.
And in fact, he often talks about scientists as storytellers, taking us through a narrative created by knowledge to better understand the story of who we are or how the world works. And it's always very moving and exciting to hear David talk that way because it is so artistic. So you're totally right. And there's interesting research out there about the different personality types that may, characterize a scientist versus an artist. Their attitude towards disturbing precedent and things like that. But to us, that's on a more surface level, and a lot of it is just driven by sociology and how we all interact with each other and what you expect out of a scientist versus what you expect out of an artist. On a fundamental brain level, their brains are doing the same thing with knowledge and received reality. And they're approaching an attitude towards life very similarly.
Anthony, among these three directions, altering, fragmenting, and combining, would you say one is more important than the other?
No, I wouldn't actually. And I think that they interact together. And, I'll mention there that one of the sort of the parents or the grandparents of our whole way of developing this thesis is the cognitive scientist Mark Turner, who is the first person who I heard articulate the idea that creativity could be all based on one mechanism. But he only had one. He had the combination one. And I was, really inspired and excited when I heard him talk, and he looked at human anthropology to justify that. But I have to say, it didn't seem to me that just one mechanism was enough. And that's where I then turned to my own feeling about composing to say, was it be enough just to combine things? And I would no, that wouldn't be enough, because variation is so important in all types of music. I mean, it is the basis of improvisation. So I think they're all equal and they're all necessary. And even in looking at any creative output, it's hard to tease apart which one was more important in terms of an innovation. It's the fact that we have all three and they work together that's so powerful.
Well, you are a composer, therefore yours is one of the most volatile and subject to personal impression fields of interest. One would say it is mostly based upon spontaneity. What say you?
Oh, no. So that's an interesting question. Music, first of all, is so wonderfully diverse across world cultures, and there are so many fantastic traditions. And in a way, the tradition that I belong to, which is Western classical music, is really an outlier because it's very scripted. Music notation does not exist in most of the world's great musical cultures, and they have been thriving for thousands of years and gloriously inventive, but every performance is in a sense a one-of-a-kind experience that never will be replicated again. And sometime, early in the Middle Ages, a group of monks in Europe came up with the idea that they could document music and keep a written record of it. And pretty soon after that, people came up with the idea, wait a second, if you could document it, you could write a script and other people could play it. And that really changes the nature of music in some important ways, including the fact that it doesn't have to be as spontaneous. And so I'll often say, how long did it take Beethoven to write his Ninth Symphony? And the answer is, from the time he started sketching it to the premiere, 10 years. And, when you hear that, you don't go, oh, well, I wish I had known that. It's not a very good piece that it took him so long to write.
Right.
We don't care. In classical music, how long it took you to write something is totally immaterial. And another interesting feature in terms of your question is you don't have to write it in chronological order. Igor Stravinsky, for instance, wrote the introduction, very, very famous introduction of The Rite of Spring, one of the most revolutionary pieces of the 20th century. He wrote that after he wrote the first act of the ballet. And, people asked him, oh, maestro, how could you write such an incredible introduction after, you wrote the rest of it? And he was like, well, I had to know what I was going to introduce, So an improviser is a very special and extraordinary kind of musician. They are composing in real time in front of the audience. Honestly, I don't do that. I work at a desk and it can take me days, weeks, and months to put together the same amount of music that an improviser might be able to do in real time in front of an audience.
Well, going further and somehow linking my next question to my previous one, there are two words closely associated with the idea of creativity, which are genius and inspiration. Yet again, in your book, I think we have genius and inspiration once or maybe just twice during the whole amount of text. How come?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm really happy you asked that. You know, I'm in a field where the presence of the great masters looms over everybody. And there's an incredible intimidation factor to have the same job as Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. But I've always looked at it that they aren't there to intimidate us or tell us we can't, but they're there to pass the baton and say, look, do the very best that you can. Music is about keeping going and having always something new to say and never saying it's the end. You know, if somebody were to tell Beethoven, you know what, you're the greatest and I just hope music stops with you, I think he'd be really upset. He wasn't trying to be the last composer. He was just trying to be the best in his day. And I think the word genius often looms over folks to keep them even from getting started and trying, feeling like, why should I bother when there are these great figures out there who are so far ahead of me? But I think the truth is that great leaps are actually a lot of small steps. And if you start walking in a direction that means something to you and you're willing to invest the time and effort into, it's amazing how far you can go. And in that sense, neither genius nor inspiration figures that much in the book because we don't want to make it seem like there's something magic or special or preordained about your ability to achieve something that's meaningful to you. And yes, it's not to say that it's going to be easy. And as we make the point over and over in the book, there's no guarantee of success, even for the most apparently brilliant person. You know, we tried to make sure there was at least half amount of stories of failure in our book to remind our readers all the time that even when everything seems to have it, an idea seems to have everything going for it, still it can fail, you know? Right. But that being said, what the human brain is capable of is part of all of us. And if you're willing to invest the time and the effort, I think any of us can surprise ourselves.
You know, I was actually thinking of that image that we all know with a writer or a composer or a philosopher just waiting like this for somebody or something to come from above and illuminate that person. Well, your book actually deconstructs that idea.
Yes, yes. No, thank you again. You know, I think there's a lot of research that shows that if you just walk in the woods, you know, that's not going to make you more creative. You're just going to enjoy a beautiful walk in the woods. And honestly, we could all use a walk in the woods right now. But if you're working mentally on a problem and you go walk in the woods, that can be a very stimulating time for your brain to work unconsciously through an issue and have an insight. And in that same way, this idea that, you know, you should just sit there and wait for lightning to strike is very ineffectual. The best thing to do is to get into habits of mind where you're always generating, for instance, multiple options to a problem and constantly challenging assumptions and thinking what might be possible. What have you ruled out that actually might possibly be useful, and such and so forth. And if your brain is trained to do that, again, you will start to surprise yourself all the time with wonderful insights, discoveries, and innovations.
Well, you and David investigate how time, geographical zone, and social context also put a mark on the creative process. We live unprecedented times, unfortunately, at least first-hand experienced and not from others' stories. How do you think they will affect the human creativity?
So the first thing that I would say is that, you know, this has been a very, very difficult time for the world, and you're suffering, you know, in terms of a global community that we haven't experienced since a world war. I mean, it really is unprecedented. And I hate to even say that the idea of silver lining even applies. But one thing this pandemic time has shown us is that creativity has to be important to human beings, because we don't like monotony. You know, if we liked monotony, then this would be like, oh, this is so awesome. I get to do the same thing every day in the same place. You know, fabulous. I've been waiting for this my whole life. Instead, you know, we are so anxious to break out of that and challenged in ways both large and small to keep our lives interesting, engage our children, have a reason to get up in the morning and look at a day and make it different from the one before. So I'm hopeful that the message, as we come out of this, stronger as a species, because no other species on the planet could be as resilient and as formidable in challenging such a you know, a dangerous you know, biological threat as us. No one can. That we will actually be more invested in our own creativity and realize how cherishable that is in our life. It spared us from the worst of this experience.
Well, actually, one aspect that your book underlines is that we never seem to settle. We always seem to want to change something or improve something or go just a different way.
Yes. In fact, I'll mention that David has a brand new book that's just come out in English called Live Wired. And I highly recommend it. I believe Humanitas will be publishing it. And David's very sorry not to be able to be with us, but he's very tied up with that new book. One of the theses of the book is that brains are what he calls infotropic, that brains are attracted to new information and they become more oblivious to the familiar. Essentially, they tune out to it. And that's a very important thing in our book, the concept of repetition suppression, that the more you are familiar with something, the more predictable it is, the less effort your brain pays attention to it. As a result, we are biologically attracted to novelty. We don't want the world to be overwhelmed with novelty. I mean, if every morning we woke up and we had a different cell phone or our computers work completely differently and so forth, that would be really disorienting, you know. And I don't think it'll ever be that fashion changes every week. You know, it's like, oh, okay, now I have to wear totally new clothes and a different hat kind of thing. But a world without that is a barren, deserted world for human beings. And our brains are incredibly stimulated. And in fact, there are brain rewards whenever it seizes on something that is a fresh experience. There are studies that David writes about that have shown that even Alzheimer's can be forestalled by having a lot of novelty in your life, because it really stimulates the brain so much. So it's part of who we are.
We may have various misconceptions about creativity. One of them being precisely that it simply springs out of the blue. What other misconceptions do you address through this book?
Oh, good question. I'll mention one other thing, because it was a misconception for me. You know, I remember one of the early conversations in the book, you know, sitting down at the dinner table where David and I were working on the book, I've always thought that creativity was in a sense, a form of childbirth, that it was the brain's way of having a baby, you know, and I associated creativity with that urge to kind of reproduce kind of thing. But I remember one day, very early on, I just showed up, and I don't know why I asked David this, but I just said, well, why do we have brains in the first place? And he was like, oh, I can tell you that. You know, he said, so the first role of the brain was guided motion through space, to be able to direct an organism through choice rather than just the attraction to something like how much salt there was in the water or how much sunlight. But once you could direct your own motion, then you had to decide where to go. And so at that point, the brain became a prediction machine. Where was I more likely to find what I need, whether that's food or shelter or a mate? And neuroscientists will talk about most of what our brain is about prediction. It's about making good decisions about the future. And in fact, the whole reason we have memories is to be able to make better predictions. They provide the statistical information out of which we judge what a good outcome is going to be. And as we continued this conversation, it became more and more clear to us that imagination is a form of prediction, that it's a prediction of something that hasn't happened yet. And whereas for most animals, what they're, as far as we know, able to predict is the likelihood of a past experience happening again. Oh, my master will take me for a walk right now because every day at this time, that's what happens. Human beings are unique in being able to make predictions about things they haven't ever experienced before. And then essentially creativity is taking that prediction and making it real. And so that was one of my own misconceptions. And I think one of the cool things about that thesis, which both case studies and neuroscientific research, even since our book has come out, has reinforced and made even more plausible, is that it shows an evolutionary basis for where imagination comes from. It's not something that just sprung up in the human mind. It is the development of a potential in brains that has been, you know, nature has been at work at, in a sense, for millions of years, but reaches a very special outcome in the human brain.
Anthony, should we use the terms like good, better, or the best when it comes to creativity? I mean, how are we to differentiate between real progress and just diversity in expression?
That is a great question. You know, it's something that maybe the one issue we treated with the lightest, softest touch in our book, because it can be so subjective and so variable over time. And of course, we're all familiar with those stories of, especially in the arts, work that was overlooked, even rejected in its own day, and now we consider it a great masterpiece. And, you know, we always, I think each generation has the conviction that we've gotten better at this and our judgment is going to be right. And if we say something is great, it'll be great for all time. And every generation falls short of that. There's just no way to know what's going to matter to people 25 years or 50 years from now.
There you go.
And so it's with only humility that one can make those kind of judgments and realize they can often be very impermanent. And it takes a long time for something to become so established in culture that we can, in a very unified way, say that's unqualified greatness, you know? But then that leads to another interesting question, which is how do you judge for yourself whether something is worth, you know, following through all the way to the end? What does the bad, the good, and the great mean to you as you're working on something? And again, it's this mysterious combination of measuring yourself against models that you respect, having certain value systems that hopefully what you're doing is living up to, but also, frankly, sometimes, again, surprising yourself and saying, well, even though I would normally think that this wasn't worthwhile, there's something that just draws me into it and I'm going to take a chance with it. And I think for anyone, you know, who is involved in a creative project, that's always a possibility, no matter what discipline they're in.
Well, like you have already mentioned, towards the end of the book, you give insights from the American education system, and also you point out the importance of learning the arts in school for all the children, why should we always underline their importance in the children's cognitive development?
And you know, that's going to enable me to circle back to your early question. What misconceptions do we overturn? And I'm going to tell, I hope your listeners will be patient with me. I'm going to tell a story. When our daughter was 4 years old, we took her to take the qualifying exam for the so-called gifted and talented public schools in Houston. And there was a particular school we were hoping she would go to, which had, among other things, a really visible arts program. And we were excited about that. And people had recommended this school. So we brought our daughter to the testing site. And she's our oldest child. We were so nervous about the test that we brought a portfolio of her artwork that she had done since she was like 3 years old. You know, it was this thick, filled with all these beautiful abstract paintings. We couldn't show it to anybody. It was just to calm ourselves that our daughter was going to do okay, kind of thing. So our daughter gets taken away and comes back a half an hour later, and we say, you know, little Sonia, how did the test go? And like all little kids, she's like, I don't know, you know, so no information. So we wait 3-4 weeks for the results, and finally we get the results. She had done extremely well on every aspect of the test except for the creativity, in which she got a 0. A 0. So we were like, Sonia, what was this test that you got a 0 on? And she said, oh, you know, the tester took a piece of paper, crumpled it up, and asked me to throw it in the garbage can. So I did that. And then they said, how many other ways could I throw it out in the garbage can? And I said, well, none. And that was the creativity test. And so there was a couple of things about that. Number one, I was appalled that the creativity in our daughter that was so apparent to my wife and I could be so invisible to this test. And the second is that any child should ever get a 0 in a test on creativity. And that was one of the signature experiences in my life that stimulated my interest in this subject, because I felt there was something horribly wrong. And our daughter was lucky. She had 2 parents who were in the arts who could tell her to not pay any attention to that test result and not think twice about it. But, you know, that's not going to be true for every child. And there were going to be other children out in the world getting 0s on this test. And what kind of a way was that to test creativity, throwing out something in the garbage, you know? That made no sense to me. So the idea that anybody should ever say, I'm not creative, you know, I will fight that tooth and nail to my very last day. And I'll say to anybody who, you know, often when David and I were talking about our book, people would come up and say, you know, thank you, enjoyed the book, but I'm not creative. And, you know, I'd say to them, well, do you enjoy saying exactly the same thing every day in exactly the same way? And they were like, well, no, of course not. I said, well, you know, come on then. You know, there are birds, wonderful bird species, that they say the same thing their whole life. No human being will ever do that. In fact, in those bird species, if they genetically alter their brains so that they don't say anything and they become more like a John Coltrane of the bird species, you know, improvising, the women birds won't listen to them. They can't find a mate. They want the repetition. They want the steadiness, you know? That's not going to win over anyone in our species. Do you give your loved ones the same birthday present every year? Do you cook the same thing for dinner? You know,
exactly.
So the fact of
eat the same thing, yes.
You know, how you see yourself, we hope to change with our book. That you realize that, wait a second, I'm beginning to see this now. That software is running in my brain, and maybe I haven't paid enough attention to it or encouraged it enough, or the world hasn't invited me to express that part of myself enough, but by golly, that software is running in my brain.
Tell me, how does the story end? Have you ever confronted that examinator, asked him what was he thinking?
No, well, I mean, I will say the story had a happy ending for my daughter. She was actually waitlisted for that school at first because of the score. It was just below the cutoff. But on the very first day of school, she was 12th on the waiting list, and the other 11 people didn't answer their phone. So they called us and said, we couldn't reach anybody. Would you be interested? And she got in. So, you know, and all of our children ended up going there. So personally, that part had a happy ending. Mm-hmm. And no, I never had a chance to talk to the tester. But I hope someday to help make a better creativity test, if, you know, for these kinds of situations. Inevitably, there are going to be those kind of tests, but I don't think that the way that it was done was anywhere near the way it should have been. And it was, you know, in talking even to people in the field afterwards, they were like, oh, well, that, you know, they didn't quite understand what they were supposed to do and this and that and the other. And I was like, you know, if the science can end up in such a distortion that essentially it's a totally arbitrary test that has nothing to do with anyone's creativity, and the fate of a particular child is being determined by that, there's something horribly wrong. So, you know, it's a story that still bothers me a lot.
Anthony, there are times like these when we give a deeper significance to the idea of healing. Can arts really heal?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. So one thing that I personally feel is that in a human life, everything that needs to be expressed will be expressed in some form. It's just how healthy and constructive will it be expressed. And I think the arts are a safe, profound, and very meaningful way to take what's inside us and put it out into the world. And in that sense, I think it really can be very healing. The one thing that I would say, though, and I often speak about this when talking about creativity, and I think it's important, is that it's up to us to determine how far out into the world anything that we create should go. Because the meeting with the world can be a dangerous and fraught thing. And I'll mention this personally, that one of the low points for me in terms of my own disappointment with myself was many years ago, I wrote my first chamber opera. And it was the biggest commission that I'd ever had. And it was given a beautiful performance and very well received. And it was really kind of a high point for me. And I was waiting for the review in the local paper. And I was very excited because I was pretty sure it was going to get a lovely write-up and that was going to be really wonderful kind of thing. And I got up at 2 a.m. to read the review because I knew that was when it got posted online. And it took me a while to find it, but the review was totally dismissive of my chamber opera in 2 sentences. And I remember the shock that something that could mean so much to me, I mean, I had spent a year writing it, could be dismissed by someone in the audience so easily. And it kept me from writing for a long time. And, you know, I'm a professor of music. It's, you know, part of my research is to be writing and composing. And for about a year, I just couldn't do it. And finally, I began to realize that it was just more fun to be on the field of play than to be watching from the stands. And instead of, you know, I'd had enough of watching other people being the ones writing the music, and I wanted to go back to do it myself. But one thing that showed is that you shouldn't send something out in the world unless you're prepared for the full spectrum of possible responses. And in a way, part of my interest in creativity was also to train myself that when you put something out into the world, know that if you get a 1 to a 5-star review, you have actually challenged your audiences. And it's likely that you've done something thought-provoking. You know, aiming for all 5s is actually unreasonable and is probably more likely that you've done something so familiar to the audience that you really haven't done anything very personal or inventive. And you should expect, actually, as a healthy, normal result, the 1 through 5. But if, for instance, you're just starting to experiment creatively and you're not prepared for 1s and 2s in response to what you're doing, it's very important not to send it don't post it on Facebook, you know, don't put it on YouTube. Show it to your loved ones and your friends, the people who are supportive. So it's a side part of the healthy question, but I think it's actually an important part, because something that can be so constructive and productive can all of a sudden also become very damaging if you put it out too far and are not ready for the responses you can get.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Anthony, the book has been published in 2017, and now we are approaching the end of this cruelest 2020. Well, given the incredible pace of the world in both science, art,
Yes.
and the whole creative process, would you change or would you revise something from the book now?
Oh, very interesting. You know, we tried to write a book, and I feel this is true of all of David's, you know, wonderful and amazing books, that it has to be written at a specific time, but it takes a deeper look at things that hopefully is able to remain sturdy and valid even as years pass.
Exactly.
And you know, it was about 50 years ago that the science of creativity even first started, that people thought that that was something worth looking at. And the neuroscience of creativity is even younger. And it's actually still very incipient. I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners have been in an fMRI machine, but it's really noisy. You can only stand to be in there for a few minutes, and they have to take regular breaks in whatever task that you're doing. So, you know, music in an fMRI it's not ideal. It's making this incredible clanging sound and so forth. Over time, the neuroscience is going to be get better. The machinery is going to be more portable and more subtle and less intrusive. And the number of researchers is dramatically increasing. So I fully expect the science to be more and more robust, you know, next year, the year after, and 5 years from now. But hopefully it will only confirm the basic theses that we put out in the book. For instance, the roots biologically in prediction, that as the source of human imagination. And there are some fantastic open questions, but I haven't learned anything in the 3 years of the book that made me think to myself, oh, gee, we got that wrong. And in fact, it's been exciting to see that actually a lot of the things that we put forth are actually being confirmed. And, you know, that's incredibly gratifying and exciting.
Well, Anthony, from music, your field of interest, your life, your profession, could you take from the whole heritage of Western classical music that is familiar to most of our viewers, just one example to variate it, to also defragment it, and then combining all together just to single out your theory from the book?
Oh, and a work that we discuss in the book immediately jumps to mind. I think that Beethoven's Grosse Fuge is the greatest composition lesson ever given by anyone. And basically anything that I would want to teach anybody about classical composition is in Beethoven's Grosse Fuge. The story behind it is interesting. Beethoven strove to write the first ever piece that would have every type of fugue in it all at once. Even Bach didn't attempt to do that. And on top of that, he decided to do that as the last movement of a string quartet. And that was also a very unusual idea. And he was actually so nervous about how the audience would respond that even though he was completely deaf at the time that he wrote it, he would still like to sit at his concerts and watch what how everybody's reacting. He was so nervous about that particular piece that he spent the performance in the bar across the street. And finally, the second violinist of the string quartet went running across the street to tell Beethoven how it had all gone. And Beethoven was like, how did it go? And he was like, oh, they loved the middle movements. In those days, if you liked something, you asked to be repeated. He said, we had to repeat the second movement and the third movement and the fourth movement. He said, yeah. But what about the great fugue, the fifth movement? He said, well, that didn't go so well. And got a horrible review. Somebody said it was totally indecipherable. The publisher was so worried about the fate of the quartet that they actually asked Beethoven to eliminate the grosse fugue from the quartet. And very unusually for our image of Beethoven, like, what do I care what the public thinks kind of person, he actually did what the publisher said. He wrote a substitute movement. And for 100 years, 100 years, that other movement was played instead of the grosse fugue. And for 100 years, even though Beethoven died a famous man, his funeral was attended by tens of thousands of people, they estimate. His work obviously continued to be played. His name was put on the top of concert halls all over the world. The grosse fugue was absolutely considered just a piece of madness. He was out of his mind. He didn't know what he was doing, kind of lost it in that one, and nobody performed it. And then in the mid-20th century, that piece came back on the radar screen. Igor Stravinsky ended up saying it was one of the most perfect pieces of music ever written. And to me, the alteration, fragmentation, and combination is illustrated so vividly, so imaginatively, and so thoroughly from beginning to end that anything that I would want to tell anybody about creativity is in that 17-minute work.
I understand. Well, at the end of the book, precisely the final chapter, you say, now close this book and go change the world. Yes. Anthony, what does the world need most right now?
We have so many needs right now. And I think our calling as a creative species is more powerful than ever. Because, you know, Marius, as you know, and thank you for all of these wonderful, wonderful questions. One of the other points that we make in the book is that we're an incredibly social species. And in fact, our creativity is in a virtuous feedback loop between our own imagination and the need to keep engaged with our fellow humans. And as we were talking about earlier, monotony is only acceptable up to a certain limit for human beings. So it's just from a social point of view, right now, we're in so much need to be constantly refreshing each other's experience of life. And we do such a beautiful contribution to our loved ones and our friends' lives whenever we bring that spark of something imaginative and fresh. That in itself, we have a great need for. But also the world is facing some, incredible problems, inequities racially with respect to gender. One of the things that I find appalling is that women have been so diminished and creatively over centuries and in cultures all over the world. That's half of the human species. They have exactly the same brains as men.
Right, and you pin that in the book, yes.
I mean, it's just, it is a human rights issue that disparity exists. And it's very exciting now to see more women film directors, more women composers, et cetera,
conductors,
et cetera.
yes.
Yeah, conductors, absolutely. I mean, there is so much work that has to be done in that area. And we have issues like climate change, which are a challenge to human imagination, whether we're going to be able to, take the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere or find a way to keep them from going in there. The number of people hopefully working on that will increase. So I see this almost as strata from the daily life to the large scale problems. And honestly, this is the contribution all of us make. If we till the soil of the routine and the given and the habitual, and we constantly make new things grow out of it, we will ultimately lead to a better world. And I think creativity needs to be ethical. It needs to be hopeful. But I do think that it's an all hands on deck issue right now, more than ever before. And hopefully our book stimulates people to say, yes, I want to be part of that. I'm human.
Anthony, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Marius, thank you. Thank you for your awesome questions. And it's been a joy and honor to be with you.
Thank you once again. Doamnelor și domnilor, Specia, rebelă, David Eagleman, Anthony Brandt, despre creativitatea oamenilor și despre modul în care ea schimbă lumea. Așadar, dacă în această perioadă în care prin forța lucrurilor ne întoarcem mai mult, inclusiv către interiorul nostru, dacă aveți nevoie de un manual de utilizare a resurselor creative care se găsesc în fiecare dintre noi, ei bine, aceasta este alternativa. Specia, rebelă, David Eagleman, Anthony Brandt. Sunt Marius Constantinescu, mulțumesc foarte mult că ați fost și astăzi alături de noi pe pagina de Facebook a editurii Humanitas. Vreau să aduc o mulțumire specială pentru Carmen Strungaru, care traduce această carte pentru noi și, evident, editurii Humanitas, care vă oferă acest volum și care a facilitat și dialogul din această seară cu Anthony Brandt. Mulțumesc foarte mult, să ne revedem sănătoși pe curând. Anthony, thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Marius. Thank you, and all the best to you and your listeners, and for a safe and healthy holidays.